Hello everyone. On behalf of Anne Rose, I welcome you to today's webinar, Sex Ed, Young People, Consent and the Australian Curriculum. My name is Michelle Robinson and I'm the Director of Evidence to Action at Anne Rose. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and on behalf of Anne Rose, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are today, we meet on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar. Today's webinar is a panel discussion followed by a live Q&A, so please send through your questions at any time during the course of the discussion and we will try to answer as many as we can. I'd also like to say a big thank you for the 75 questions we have received as part of the registration process. It's been an area of great interest. This is a confronting topic and some participants may find it distressing. It is important to take care of yourself while watching the webinar. If you would like to access support, please contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800-737-732 or Lifeline on 131114. Adolescence is a time where ideas and beliefs about relationships, including gender roles and sex, are being developed. Education about sex and consent occurs in a variety of ways, including through school, youth services, the media, families and parenting, peers, and pornography. Evidence shows that pornography impacts knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about sex, intimacy, consent, and relationships among young people. By improving the sexual and consent education we provide to young people, we are better able to control the message, promote healthy relationships, and help prevent violence against women. This sentiment is echoed by Chantal Contos, a former student of the Sydney Private School, who launched a petition calling for earlier and more comprehensive sexual education, suggesting it address topics such as consent, rape culture, toxic masculinity, and queer sex education. The Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, also known as ACARA for short, have proposed changes to enhance sexual and consent education in schools. Today, the panel will draw on their diverse experiences and research to discuss the rationale for the changes, the role of digital cultures in young people's relationships and sexual learning, and opportunities for sexual and consent education. This discussion is particularly important because ACARA is currently inviting feedback on the proposed revisions, and there is an opportunity for all of you to contribute to the discussion. Please see the chat box for the link to take part in the consultation. I'd like to introduce you to the panel. Janice Atkin, Curriculum Specialist, Health and Physical Education for the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. Professor Kath Albury from Swinburne University of Technology. Professor Alan McKee from the University of Technology, Sydney. Anne-Marie Henley, Education Advisor, Aboriginal Focus at SHINE in South Australia. And SHINE is the Sexual Health Information Network and Education. Oliver Keane, or Ollie, Schools Coordinator for SHINE SA. Professor Helen Carl, University of Melbourne. And Kim Henderson from Our Watch. Okay, thanks everybody. And thank you very much for joining us today on this really important topic. Kath, I think we'll start with you. Kath, outside of the school environment, how do young people learn about sex? How does different media, such as pornography and other digital media, impact their learning? And then lastly, is this a problem for educators? Sorry, three-part question.
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. So young people learn a lot of different things in digital spaces, and that's because digital space is so interwoven with everyday life now, and there's not a very clear distinction for most of us, but particularly for younger people, about what is offline and what is online. One of the things that I think sometimes raises concern for adults is the idea that all online spaces are full of disinformation or misinformation exclusively around sex. This is not the case. There's very sophisticated and nuanced and very sensitive conversations about consent, about sexuality and gender diversity. There's a lot of peer support among young people around sexual learning. It doesn't mean that there's not really bad information around sex, and including some really nasty pockets of online spaces where there's kind of peer support for aggressive or abusive sexual behavior and encouragement of that. But I think one of the big things that I've really seen in my research over the past decade or so, talking with adults about what they know about young people's learning online, is that adults really lack digital literacy in the main. Adults are often very uncomfortable with their knowledge of the spaces that young people are learning in online. They feel very awkward and uncomfortable about talking with young people. I'm talking about teachers as well as parents and other kinds of carers. And for that reason, they feel like talking about digital media or sexuality in digital media is a no-go zone, because they're not confident about the content. Teachers don't have any pre-service training in relation to mediated aspects of sexuality. They don't have much in-service training in this space. I did a big project with over 100 teachers and educators, asking them whether they'd had any training. One person had had a one-day in-service, but basically that was kind of as far as it went. And so many adults are very at sea when they're trying to think about, well, how do I talk about mobile phones and what they mean specifically in relation to sexual learning? How do I talk about different platforms like Tumblr or Instagram and what that means in relation to sexuality? So there are lots of calls often for young people to develop better literacy in this space. If there's one thing that I could really say in relation to supporting educators and supporting teachers, it would be that teachers need a lot of support around digital literacy, and their managers in health spaces and their principals in education spaces need support around digital literacy, because for the teachers that I spoke to, often they felt their managers or their principals were very risk averse and were gatekeeping when they tried to bring more I guess, young person-centered content into their work.
Thanks, Kath. I think that's framing the issue really well. And I, as a parent of a young woman, definitely lacked digital literacy as I was rearing her. Alan, we'll turn to you now. The Australian curriculum is, and I've got a different question here for you, across discussions about porn literacy, it is often said that young people should be taught that porn shows unrealistic sexual relationships. You don't agree with this. Could you tell us why? And what are young people looking for in pornography that they're not finding elsewhere?
Thanks for that, Michelle. Well, first of all, we know the research has shown, and this has been true for decades, that what young people actually want from sex education is they want to know how to have sex, and ideally how to have good sex, how to be more pleasurable for themselves and for their partners. And schools as a whole do not teach that. And it's actually kind of hard in the current climate to imagine how schools would ever be able to teach that. Obviously, we want parents to be a huge part of that conversation as well. And I'll take this opportunity, as I do every time I talk in public, to give a shout out to the West Australian Government's book, Talk Soon, Talk Often, which is a guide for parents on talking to your kids about sex, which is about the single most important thing in young people's healthy sexual development is having trusted adults with whom they can talk openly about sex. Everything else is secondary. So that's ideally what we'd like. But again, in the real world, we know that large numbers of parents are not comfortable telling their adolescent kids how to have good sex. And so in that kind of context, it's not surprising that young people keep going back to sexual entertainment products, because those are the ones that are about having sexual pleasure. So of course they're going to keep going back there. In that context, what can we teach our young people to help support them in navigating those kind of materials? Now, you mentioned that I don't think that the approach, some porn literacy courses start from the assumption that we should tell young people porn is not realistic. And I don't think that's a particularly useful way to approach the issue, because that's not the main problem. That's not actually what we need to be thinking about. So some of the main things that we need to communicate with young people, well, probably the single most important thing, is that in pornography, consent is not shown on screen. And that is vitally important. Now, the consent happens. In commercial mainstream pornography, contracts are signed, discussions are had before the recording starts. The consent exists, but it's not on screen. And this is why I say the kind of the language of realism isn't particularly important, because that is actually really realistic. Because in the real world, most people don't have conversations about consent, and that's a bad thing. This is a point where pornography being realistic is a bad thing, because we want to change the world. We want people to start having sex where they are negotiating consent as part of their sexual pleasure. Another thing that I would love to see taught to young people, and this is me, this is my old 1970s radical feminist history, but let's tell young people that in pornography, most women have orgasms from having a penis in their vagina. That's not realistic. That's not what it's like in the real world. But in pornography, we're still getting these messages. Let's tell young people that. Let's tell young women that if you're going to, if you aspire to have an orgasmic sexual life, then just having a penis in your vagina, as pornography shows, that's not actually going to be a key way of getting sexual pleasure. But one thing, and again, this is why the discourses of realism are complex, is because I think there is something that we could all learn from pornography. And that is that people in pornography talk endlessly and openly about what they actually want sexually. And that's something that there is not enough of in real life at the moment. When we did some research with young people a couple of years back, asking them how you would ask for what you want sexually, there was an almost universal agreement amongst all of them that you must never say it out loud, that it was all about body language and hints. And that's how you kind of suggest it, because their thinking was, if you actually talk out loud about what you want sexually, it destroys the romance. And there's this myth going around, and I blame romantic comedies for this, that when you're in love, you're telepathic, and that you know how to swoon and he knows how to kiss you. And if you actually say it out loud, it spoils it. And I think that is something that we really do need to change. So those are the kind of things I think that we want to be telling people about pornography and consent. And another one of the challenges with the saying it's not realistic is that we recently did a project where we looked at some of these programs saying that pornography is not realistic. And some of the things they said were not realistic about pornography was, in real life, women aren't nearly that into sex. In real life, women do not have multiple orgasms. In real life, women are not sexually permissive. In real life, women are into anal sex. And this list of things that were said to be unrealistic. So a lot of the discourse about porn not being realistic, it's normative attempts to impose conservative views on women's sexuality. So that's not a useful way to go forward, but we need to focus on the ways in which pornography doesn't show consent, the ways in which it misrepresents women's pleasure, and also about what we can learn from pornography about being open and talking to our sexual partners about what we actually want. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. It's a big call for the curriculum. Janice, turning to you now. So the Australian curriculum is being reviewed, and there are a number of proposed changes to enhance sexual and consent education in schools. Janice, you're from ACARA. Can you tell us about how these what the proposed changes are, and how can our audience participate in the consultation?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And as part of the review process, ACARA was asked to explore opportunities to strengthen the teaching of consent education in schools, and it was it was generated from a lot of the media attention, particularly to Chanel Contos's petition, and also to some of the reactions from Brittany Higgins' press conference and the handling of that. So the consent and sexual health education obviously sits within health and PE, which is my learning area that I'm looking after. So as part of the process, we've brought together a group of key experts that are working in the respectful relationships and sexuality space to support our work, because one of the things that certainly we recognise at ACARA, and I think education sectors more broadly recognise, is that within our sector we don't have the expertise to be able to do this well alone. So we recognise this must be a partnership between the key stakeholders that are working in this space outside of education, as well as the work that we're doing. So our group includes representatives from ANROS, who are hosting the webinar today, Our Watch, the E-Safety Commission, and then we've got wonderful people like Helen and other key academics that are conducting research specifically with schools in this area. They're also supporting us as well. And as Michelle said, the Australian curriculum is currently under review, and it's actually our proposed revisions are available at the moment for public consultation. So this is a really timely webinar to encourage all of you out there to have a look at the proposed revisions and provide feedback based on your experience and your knowledge of working with young people in this space as well. So in terms of the changes that we've put forward, we've worked on including more detailed guidance for teachers about what should be taught, more broadly through our relationships and sexuality focus area. And within this guidance, which if you go onto the All Elements document that's available through the consultation link that Rachel shared earlier, you'll find this on page 11. So essentially what we're trying to do within this guidance is create some expectations about what all students should learn about. So the specific changes we've made around consent and respect for relationships include students learning about the nature of consent, the strategies that they need around being able to give permission, gain permission, but also refuse permission, but across a range of situations. So we want this conversation to be more than just about giving consent around sexual interactions. We want it to be about learning the skill of taking control of their bodies almost from a very young age. So that also includes setting boundaries about what they're comfortable and not comfortable with happening to their bodies by other people. So we also look at the skills needed to give and gain consent appropriately. So that would include things like assertive communication, those refusal skills that are so important, but also those communication skills and that level of comfort and confidence to be able to have those conversations that Alan was talking about, but not just in a sexual situation, but also in other situations that may be with different peers or different adults that they may be involved with. I think a very important part of the learning needs to be around some of the legal requirements related to consent in a range of different areas again. So this would also include issues around sharing images and sharing videos of themselves and other people as well, but also understanding those factors that make giving or gaining consent difficult. So I think sometimes there's an assumption made that it's easy to be able to say no, or it's easy to be able to ask the question about consent. And I think it's really important for young people to understand that this is a skill that needs to be learnt and practiced and reflected on before they'll necessarily get it right. And there's going to be some probably uncomfortable situations when the mood is killed when they're asking for consent, but learning how to do that in a way that doesn't kill the mood is important as well. There's also discussions, and certainly we've added guidance in there around the impact of power and coercion on boundary setting in relationships. And I think that links into some of those factors around some of the difficulties around particularly refusing consent if there's interactions and the relationship is such that one party may not feel like they have the power to say no, and how that can lead to problems with boundary setting as well. And then also some strategies for dealing with relationships when there is an imbalance of power or when there is abuse happening. So what are some safe ways that if the relationship is abusive, that a young person can leave that relationship? And the 2 points that we have included in the guidance, but in reflection, looking at the proposed changes in the content, we haven't captured as strongly as we could and possibly should, is around the challenging of gender stereotypes and social norms that lead to some of the inequalities and disrespect and violence that are occurring in society. So that idea of understanding the nature of gender-based violence and unpacking some of the beliefs and attitudes that drive that behaviour. We've certainly got reference to it in our guidance in the focus area description, but I don't think it's coming through as strongly as it could in some of the curriculum content. So certainly we'd love to get some feedback from the audience today, and certainly through our consultation survey around whether that's content that people believe is important to have in the curriculum as we move forward. So essentially we've got this first part of the guidance which sits in the front end of the curriculum, and then we've got content descriptions and elaborations that unpack the teaching of consent more broadly. So currently the content sits under a framework of respectful relationships. So we've got a thread of content that looks specifically at respectful relationships from foundation to year 6. And that's where you'll see consent pop up, certainly in years 7 to 10 within content descriptions, but we've got it as suggested content in the primary years. And again, this has been put out as a way of starting the conversation. So certainly we're receiving feedback from some key stakeholders that perhaps we need to include required teaching and learning around consent in the primary years, rather than it just being a suggested way that you could explore respectful relationships and protective behaviours within those years of schooling. So again, that's the sort of feedback that we'd be interested in getting, either supporting what we've done so far or urging us to do more in that space and strengthen that more. So in terms of how you can get involved, and ACARA is really keen to get feedback from key stakeholders in this space, certainly because it was a priority that came late onto the table. We'd made some changes, but then we're really given a much broader scope to strengthen that. And so it really is a historical period in time where we've got an opportunity to really ensure that all students get access to learning, that really they have a right to learn, and that those skills and understandings are going to serve them well, not just as young people, but going into their later lives as well. So certainly Rachel has shared the link to the consultation website. On that consultation website, you can navigate through the different learning areas, and there's a couple of places where you can navigate to the health and physical education section of the website. And on that health and PE website, if you scroll down the page, you'll be able to access, I would suggest, 2 documents that you download. So there's the All Elements document, which is a PDF, and that includes all of the information that will be that's proposed to be included in the revised curriculum. And it's on page 11 of this document that you'll find the guidance around relationships and sexuality focus area. And the second document I'd encourage you to have a look at is the comparative information. So that gives you a direct one-to-one comparison of what the current content requires students to learn and what the proposed revisions are to that content. And you will note there'll be some specific changes, particularly in the foundation and year 2 level, that I would expect you would have some concerns about, because we've certainly got some strong feedback around some of the content that we've reduced in those areas. that needs to be reinstated. So certainly that would be an area to look at. But we've also included those revised content descriptions in Year 7 and 10 where you will see consent identified. So I strongly encourage you all to engage with the consultation. There is a consultation survey that you can complete, but it is quite a long survey and it is directed at people that work within the education sector. So if you look at that survey and it causes you alarm and distress about the length of it and the questions that are being asked, then please don't hesitate. There's a button on there where you can submit comments and feedback via an email, and I'll put that email address in the chat space now so that you can access that. So we're happy to receive written feedback via email, and that'll be included in the consultation. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Janice. And I guess as a bit of a follow-up question, ACARA is responsible for developing the curriculum, but who's responsible for the implementation of the curriculum?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so the curriculum being developed by ACARA, once we've published the revised curriculum, that gets handed over to the state and territory jurisdictions and the individual education sectors within those jurisdictions, so the Catholic sector and also the independent sector. So those jurisdictions and sectors are the bodies that are responsible for how the curriculum is interpreted, translated and implemented in their schools. And I think this is a really important point to make, because there's some people in, certainly in media circles and in the general public, who think as long as we get this into the curriculum, then that's going to be the magic pill to change everything. And it certainly won't. We've had these drastic curriculum changes previously, and if they're not supported by really strategic and ongoing professional learning, development of teacher resources and those partnerships with key organisations within the broader community, then change just doesn't happen. So I think this webinar provides a really good opportunity for that partnership to develop around organisations in the community providing their expertise to the education sector to get the curriculum right first of all, and then hopefully there'll be partnerships around the rolling out of professional learning to build capacity for teachers, and then also that development of resources for teachers to use with young people that address these issues as well.
Great, thanks Janice. And I guess moving to you, Kim, Our Watch is one such important organisation outside of the department. How important is the Australian curriculum to improving the consent and sexual education of young people? And what are the other factors at play?
Thanks so much, Michelle, and hello to the other panel members and everyone who's joining us today. Curriculum from our perspective is, of course, an important component of the work that schools can do in preventing violence against women and in supporting children and young people to develop important skills and knowledge on relationships. But creating a respectful and inclusive school goes beyond what's taught in the classroom, and I think that's what Janice was just referring to. It's an important part of the puzzle, but there's more work for us all to do. So international and national evidence shows that to be effective, respectful relationships education needs to take a whole of school approach to change. And this means, in addition to teaching and learning, we need to support staff through professional learning. We need to look at changes to school culture and environment. We need to look at leadership and commitment, support for staff and students, of course, and beyond that, engaging with families and communities. And we really need to focus on transformation, transforming schools' cultures to promote gender equality, respect, and non-violence. So Our Watch has piloted a whole of school approach in both secondary and primary schools, and our evaluations have demonstrated that positive changes can be effected when the whole school community commits to preventing violence against women and promoting gender equality. And we've seen positive outcomes for student attitudes and teacher confidence and knowledge. For example, the findings from our recently released evaluation of our primary schools pilot included significant changes in student attitudes, such as students being less likely to consider traditionally masculine and feminine jobs and activities for either boys or girls only, and staff demonstrating a strong commitment to respectful relationships education. But on the flip side, unfortunately, schools can also be sites in which beliefs, attitudes, social norms, structures and practices that perpetuate sexual violence manifest. And we've seen some of this reported in the media in recent months. And this is why a whole of school approach is so important, because even the best designed lessons delivered in the classroom can really be undermined if students experience disrespectful behaviours and practices in the playground or in other areas of their school or even at home. And I think we really need to look at the importance of the role of adults and the messages that young people receive from the adults around them, that this influences their attitudes and behaviours. And that's why it's important for adults to role model positive behaviours, to see adults challenging gender stereotypes and rejecting victim-blaming messages about sexual relationships, for example, and also responding sensitively and appropriately to disclosures of sexual violence. But as I said to begin with, the curriculum is a central part of this, and we see this review as an opportunity to embed some key elements that can advance prevention of violence against women through the curriculum. For example, early, age-appropriate and continued learning is critical, and for us, we think this means that the Australian curriculum should ensure all students are engaged in learning on respectful relationships and consent from foundation to year 10. So just to respond to Janice's question there, we would see that as being required rather than optional. We also would love to see content that directly engages learners in identifying and addressing the drivers of gender-based violence, and embedding content that develops students' understanding of gendered power relations and the attitudes and norms that drive violence against women across the curriculum, and actively challenge these in classroom teaching as well as throughout school. Finally, on the curriculum, we do think that it's important for the curriculum to address pornography. So research that we conducted shows that many young people are accessing pornography at a time when they're developing their understanding of gender roles and identities, sex and relationships. And our research also showed that use of pornography was associated with less progressive attitudes about relationships, sex and gender roles, and a belief that women are sex objects, as well as rape myth acceptance. That is the false beliefs about sexual assault that shift blame from the perpetrator to the survivor. And the research that we undertook included surveying directly 2,000 young people. And it's supported too by a range of other academic research and literature, including, for example, the recent article by Marie Crabb and Michael Flood in the American Journal of Sexuality Education. But given that pornography can perpetuate harmful gender stereotypes and strengthen attitudes supportive of violence against women, we really think that primary prevention efforts, including through respectful relationships education, should support young people and guide them on how to think critically about the portrayal of gender roles and relationships in pornography, as well as the potential impacts in their own lives, and including age-appropriate discussions about pornography with adolescents through respectful relationships education, complemented by support to parents and guardians, we think is critical. And just finally, I'd like to say that we see a comprehensive and effective approach is really needed to teach consent within our schools. We can't teach consent without also addressing the societal context in which those discussions take place. And best practice curriculum would include specific lessons on consent, but would also contextualise these within a broader program of teaching and learning about gender equality and respectful relationships in all contexts, both online and offline, but ensuring that it challenges and critically engages with that societal context in which sexual violence occurs. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks for that, Kim. Turning to you now, Anne-Marie and Ollie. Shine South Australia is a not-for-profit organisation and provides primary care services and education for sexual and relationship wellbeing. One of the workshops that you run is Teaching It Like It Is, Aboriginal, which is of course designed to educate and support Aboriginal young people in relationships and sexual health. Can you tell us about this program and how is education about consent best shaped and delivered for Indigenous young people?
Thank you, Michelle. So, hi everyone. I'm going to start us off by giving a bit of context about how our program works, and then Anne-Marie is going to translate that into what it means for Aboriginal contexts. But of course, starting out with our little section, I want to acknowledge the land that we're kind of zooming in magically from today is the land of the Kaurna people, and we respect their relationship ongoing with this country. We also acknowledge that in the space of relationships and sexual health, we always strive to understand the gaps in outcomes for many of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, and we work to create services and activities that fill those gaps. It's been really nice to hear the other speakers today, and I think a lot of the work that we do at Shine links in with a lot of the ideas that we've said today, which is really heartening for us to hear and good for us to collaborate, I guess, moving forward. So, like Michelle said, we're from the Schools Education and Support team, and we essentially support schools to deliver relationships and sexual health in a confident and comprehensive way. The approach we've been using has been running since about 2003, and we've achieved some really good outcomes for our students and teachers. Our team is made up of teachers and school staff, so we really get a lot about how classrooms actually work and a lot of the complexities that there is for daily teachers and educators. So we in our team, we have the time to keep updated on research and recommendations and attend events like these, and we help translate that to the teachers who are really, I guess, on the front line, on the ground level, delivering this stuff to their kids. And along with that, we also consistently check in with the students who are receiving this education. So we have an online survey that we get about 4,000 responses from each year from young people who essentially want to tell us about how they've found their education. And this informs our work. So then we're able to better understand the stuff that they want to learn about or the language that they're using. So it's kind of this big circular approach, which is really awesome. And we know that, I mean, like it's been touched on today, relationships and sex ed isn't exactly something that a teacher can major in at uni just yet. So we offer training and support so that schools can feel like they're really knowledgeable in this content area, which helps inform that whole school approach that a few other panelists have spoken about today. So yeah, we like to think of ourselves almost as the bridge between the ACARA standards, which we've recognised are quite important, and the real life environment. And a good way to kind of display that is with a lotus diagram that I'm going to have Rachel display in a moment. So hopefully that pops up. And essentially, that shows us some key areas that are within the Australian curriculum, but then how that's translated to what it looks like in a school environment. And this really showcases, again, how complex this stuff is and how consent is one very important part of a wider understanding of healthy and respectful relationships, communication, boundaries, power, gender norms, all that other stuff that's already been touched on a lot today. So this is kind of the base level of how we support our schools. And as far as the nuts and bolts of it, I guess, we deliver mainly 2-day courses with teachers and school staff, and these courses are usually either secondary, primary, disability, or Aboriginal. And after those courses, schools get books with a bunch of lessons. So for our secondary and primary teachers, they get 15 lessons per year level, and that ranges from years 5 to 10, and we're working on a 3-4 version as well. And for our Aboriginal specific 2-day course, school staff leave with the Yarning Like It Is book, so something that looks a little bit like this, that's broken across into activities per, I guess, topic area rather than specific lessons. And after this training as well, once teachers leave our doors, they're often met with lots of ongoing phone calls and meetings and supports, really just whatever the school staff need to feel confident. Because we know that the old model of an organisation coming in and just doing a once-off lesson on maybe how babies are made and how puberty works just doesn't cut it anymore. And we know from research that's maybe already been mentioned today that students feel most comfortable learning from their teachers. They don't really mind the age or gender or hair colour of their teacher. They've reported time and time again that they want a teacher who's non-judgmental and comes at them with confidence. So we know that schools are welcome to use these lessons and programs, but if they don't follow it from start to finish, that's great, as long as they've had those good conversations with the kids that are relevant to their kids that are in front of them. And that's where knowing school context is really important for our teachers, and that's why they're best placed to deliver this learning in a confident way. So within kind of the importance of school context and cultural safety, I might now hand over to Anne-Marie to talk more about what that means from an Aboriginal perspective and what a lot of our schools are up to. Anne-Marie?
Thanks, Ollie. Ollie's already done the acknowledgement, so I won't do that. But I'd like to begin by saying, could we just have that slide back up again, please? I'd like to begin by saying that collaboration is a really good place to start. You need to use a collaborative approach and inclusive approach with your Aboriginal community, with your students, your families, your school staff. You must ask your audience what they want and need to learn about. There's no sense packing them in to sit them down at these lessons with a lot of irrelevant content. And also for the Aboriginal community, there may be specific issues in the community. And I'm talking about maybe rural or remote areas. There may be specific issues that need to be addressed there. So this is where Aboriginal voices really need to be heard. You also need to understand that one size doesn't fit all when we talk about Aboriginal communities. What happens here, even in South Australia, from the suburbs to rural areas to remote areas, is vastly different. So this again comes back to the educators knowing their students and families. And like I said, you've got cultural norms out in regional and rural areas, but what happens when those kids come to the city? Like, you still need to be mindful of these things. So necessarily, you know, or maybe working in a regional area for 3 years is not going to cut it when you go to you come to the city and then just go, oh, hey, I know it all because I've worked with a few. That's not going to happen. So you will need to re-evaluate your knowledge, and you need to actually understand your limitations. And you've got to work within Aboriginal context. And again, this goes back to talking to your Aboriginal community around, whether it's the person, if you've got like an Aboriginal educator in school. My course is specifically designed to not just be about curriculum lessons. Like, this is about having these conversations with the students. Like, kids often feel more comfortable with their Aboriginal workers. So if it just comes up in a conversation, and I'm not saying they have to, they're not responsible for teaching it or anything like that, but it's just about having the knowledge. So if a child comes up and says, hey, you know, I'm thinking about coming out and I feel really scared or unsupported or something, at least if the Aboriginal educator has also been trained, that gives them a bit of a good standing, I guess, into at least to know to point that student in the right direction, or ring us or whatever, you know, to look for resources to be able to support that student. I'd also say, obviously, as you can see with the Lotus diagram, it's very complex. What this is basically the things in green are basically what we touch on in my 2-day course, but also that changes from course to course. Because if we have people ringing up or, you know, saying, listen, we need things about maybe red flags and self-care, we'll focus on that, like we'll change it up. But basically all of this has to be a holistic and comprehensive approach, and it needs to be ideally from reception. And when we talk about consent from such a young age, we're talking about them being responsible for their own bodies. You know, we're not talking about sex at that stage. We're talking about, you know, go and give Uncle Johnny a kiss or a hug, and the little one doesn't want to do it. You know, if they say, don't force these kids. We need to be having these conversations about consent and young children or young people knowing that they are actually in charge of their own bodies. So by the time it actually ends up getting to the teen years, if ideally, like if this has happened from reception, it's not going to be a big issue for them if they've had consent taught to them in age-appropriate context all the way through. Hopefully it's not going to be that much of an issue by the time they become a teenager. You need to be very clear with what consent is and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like and what it sounds like. They need to understand that you can change your mind just because you've said yes to starting something. And then you change your mind halfway through. People need to understand, young people need to understand that this is vital. Like, it's okay, it's valid, and it's legal. It's that, you know, if somebody is persisting after you have said no, or even if it's like within the way that you show with your body language and stuff, they need to be very clear on these things. So again, I would say the best steps to make it happen would be to know your students and to have all of your relevant educators educated in these sorts of trainings, I guess. Have Aboriginal collaboration and involvement, and in regional and rural areas, this could also incorporate community controlled health services, and then have some key messages as well. So these can be used to inform the families about what's going to be taught. This could be used to reinforce what was taught. And I guess just offer, again, like everybody said, offer comprehensive training for all educators and ongoing support and updates for all educators. So that's basically, and make it inclusive for all literacy levels, like lower literacy, like you can adapt these lessons, they need to be adapted so they can actually be included for even like inclusive education as well. So that would be our recommendations for that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie, and thanks, Ollie. It's a really great segue to you, Helen, because your past and your current research has evaluated programs such as respectful relationships in primary and secondary schools. Can you walk us through the factors that impact the implementation of these programs?
Well, I would like to talk about 2 T's. One is T for timetable. Let's just get it out there. Timetable is the absolute enemy of us doing the good work we know we need to do and have great information and research to guide us in doing in secondary schools. There's not enough time in the health PE curriculum to develop all of the topic areas and provide them all substantially to children and young people. And at the time when young people need it most pertinently in their everyday life, which is by the time they reach year 11 and 12, they are almost likely to get nothing because their current subject homes don't provide opportunity for this kind of relationships education, sexuality education, respectful relationships education. So we need to face up to this fact in our country. The assessment tail is wagging the curriculum dog to such an extent that it dismisses the top end of secondary school. So timetable is currently our enemy. We need to speak about that and address it. Now, the other T, our best friend, T for teacher. Curriculum is coming to the students through the teachers. So not only do we have to have student-centric and child and youth-centric approaches that understand what children and young people need, we absolutely need to respect the workforce and find out what teachers need to get into these sensitive topic areas where they're being asked to break some social taboos that most parents are too scared to break themselves, and actually talk in careful, informed, supportive and useful ways with children and young people. Now, we know a lot from the research around professional development about what works for teachers. They really appreciate having a chance to sample the very same learning activities we provide for the kids. Because guess what? They never had the opportunity to do this kind of learning, usually themselves, in a social way where they're having conversations with others that are structured and purposeful. So we need to help teachers develop what we call their pedagogical or their method capabilities in this area. But our research in schools also shows us that teachers are facing additional forms of labour, particularly by the time they get to the more sensitive topic areas, where we're teaching about the possibility that sex has taken place without consent. Let's just stop calling that consent education. That's respectful relationships education. And we are talking about violence prevention or prevention of sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual abuse. Okay, it gets all nicey when we just walk around calling it consent education. So let's be real about what we're asking teachers to do when they do this work. Now, our teachers are telling us that it's quite troubling for them. There's emotional labour and political labour involved in opening these conversations in schools. Why emotional labour? Because they care about the children. They think about how some children might be troubled by this. Some children have had troubling histories. Some staff have had troubling histories or current experiences. So they really, really want to know how to do this well. That's why they need time in professional learning, not only to look at the evidence-based approaches, but to work through them with colleagues so that they develop their readiness together and their support as a workforce to support each other to do this well in their school setting. So they need that kind of learning to do this emotional labour that the rest of the community are still a bit nervous about doing in their own families in the main. The second thing is the political labour. Teachers are getting massive pushback and finger pointing and blaming and shaming by the community when we should be actually thanking them and heralding them for being prepared to do or to start to do this work on our behalf to advance our broader ethical and social justice and social safety goals. But they're getting pushback, they get organised targeting, they get protests from parents. And you know what? They weren't trained to deal with that because not too many parents are attacking the school over how they do math education or how they do art education or any other form of learning. So we need to hold the workforce close and provide them with the resourcing, support and time they need to do this well, because their care factor is only second to that of parents. So with that in mind, I think we need to understand that when we're asking schools to provide for good consent education, we really need to look at what would be foundational, what would be sitting underneath that to make that possible. One is the teacher and the timetable capabilities. But the other is the actual broader curriculum home. So in our program, we seek our work on what we call social and emotional learning. In other words, we understand that if you want to have great relationships, you need to develop social skills, and they're really, really important before you get to the trickier and more complex relationships that involve sex and sexual relationships. So sitting on a basis of social emotional learning is a really strong way to go. Explicitly working on violence prevention of all sorts and gender equality and respectful relationships within that is really, really important. And then we finally have to acknowledge that if we've opened this conversation, the society is also now asking us to consider that some forms of sex or violence that are gendered in nature happen in family and against children, where consent is not an issue at all. So the intersection that's required in teaching also for the prevention of violence means that we need to understand this is a really big piece of work, and cutting the salami into slices and pulling one bit off and calling it consent education and forgetting the rest really won't do. We need to hold it all together and take people on a well-supported journey to provide learning with and for our children and young people. We know from the research that if we do it well, we will produce much healthier, happier, safer and more respectful people. And just speaking to one well-known fear that seems to run everywhere in the world that parents and community members tend to have about sex ed. They seem to have this fear that if we teach kids about sex, they'll all run away and start doing lots of it. Actually, we find the reverse, that the better our sex ed is, the more likely people are to make safe, healthy, informed and respectful choices. So if we're going to do it, let's do it well, bring the teachers in as our partners and get the timetable to be an enabler, not a barrier. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for those 2 T's. I think that's been a really powerful way to end the panel discussion. We do only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to move now to the Q&A, and I'll also give Janice an opportunity to comment on next steps before we leave, if there's anything further you wanted to say about that, Janice. So as I said earlier, we have received many questions. The first one I'll throw to the panel, and I might get Janice or Helen to lead with the response. When is it a suitable time to teach sex education to children and the age of consent law? What age appropriate?
I think Janice has already commented on the curriculum makes guidance for every level from foundation through, but what we might just say is that we normally put that with 2 words, age and stage, age appropriate and stage appropriate education. So we teach things at the level that kids need to know them, are capable of understanding them at a certain age or stage in their lives. So the basic principles of respect and care for self, care for others, respect for your own bodily autonomy and that of others is taught from actually well before children go to school. We even teach them not to bite other people's bodies, you know. We teach it in an age appropriate way. And we know that if we do that well, that it's not a big shock when we start to learn about these things in more complex, intimate relationship scenarios.
And our certainly the way that we're looking at the revisions within the curriculum currently is trying to introduce some of those age-appropriate examples of that learning in terms of gaining permission for things like you know, joining different games within PE context, or sharing of possessions, or negotiating personal space. That can start from a very early age as explicit teaching in the curriculum.
Ollie or Anne-Marie, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, one thing that I thought of quickly in connecting what Helen and Janice have already said is that we often support teachers to
Ollie, you're dropping out. Is anyone else having that problem?
Model what can
Ollie, that you're dropping out with that. I'm just wondering if you turned your video off to repeat what you just said. It might be the bandwidth.
Is that any better?
That's better.
Thank you.
Ah, cool. I won't take too much time, but I was just saying about how giving examples of what consent looks like, sounds like, and feels like is usually the model that we've found really successful from, right through early ages all the way through to secondary schools, because then kids get really concrete examples of what they're listening for and what they're displaying as consent. Anne-Marie, what do you think?
Absolutely. I was going to say we do a quick exercise with stoplights, and you know, you've got your red, orange, and green, and then you've got scenario cards, and then you've got your, you know, obviously green. You place it in the right place, but then it eventually comes down to like the middle bits. The people who've put the things in the middle, there is actually no middle bit when it comes to consent. It really is yes or no. There's just no in between. So that's a really good activity that we've prepared, that we've got some really good feedback on from educators.
Thank you. Thank you. There are a lot of questions on that very topic. There are also a few questions around how young people's voices have been included. How do we ensure youth-centered design in the development of respectful relationships and comprehensive sexuality education?
Who is that for? Sorry, is that for us or anybody, or?
For anybody. Helen?
I think there's a lot of ways that we do that. For a start, researchers do this routinely. They go out and research with young people about what works and what doesn't work. Good programmers, I think as Oliver and Anne-Marie have already noted, do this in getting feedback on the actual doing of the programs. Effective teachers do it because they are trained in using reciprocal feedback with students, so giving students feedback but getting feedback from students. And then even in the design of the learning activities themselves, as you can hear from Anne-Marie's examples, typically there are learning activities that involve people's voices, have them doing the thinking and working out together. So the teacher and the peers in the classroom also hear from each other. And let's not dismiss that. Young people really say what they need is a structured opportunity to talk aloud and think aloud with other young people about these things in a slowed down way, because in life it can all happen so fast. So that youth-centric or child-centric, voice-centric method is there at every level.
Thank you, Helen. I'm seeing the rest of the panel nod. We have come to the end. Janice, I would invite you to one sort of final comment about next steps, if you can do that fairly briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd just reiterate that the public consultation period is an excellent opportunity. Any organisations out there that are working with young people, we would love to hear the voice of young people as part of your feedback. So we strongly encourage you to involve the young people you're working with in any feedback that you submit. In terms of our next steps, so the consultation period finishes on the 8th of July, which is 2 weeks on Thursday, and we're hoping that people don't get caught out because there's a few people that think it's a Friday finish, but it is Thursday, the closing date. So once we have the consultation feedback through, we'll go through another revision process, and then those revisions will be presented to our curriculum reference group and teacher reference group, and then move through the approval processes. So the intention at this stage is that the revised curriculum will be published on the ACARA website at the start of next year, ready for the next school year. But again, jurisdictions at a state and territory level and sectors within those jurisdictions will determine the implementation timeline. And no announcements have been made about when schools will actually have to start implementing the revisions. But and some jurisdictions will pick it up and run with it straight away, and others will go through a process of reinterpreting it for their system. But they're the next steps.
Great, thank you, Janice. And look, we have come to the end of our session today, but before I go, I'd just like to say thank you so much to the panel for sharing your insights and your knowledge and your differences of opinion about this really important topic. I think it's been a really, really useful and very valuable discussion. And thank you to the audience and for all of your questions. And for any researchers tuning in today, if you're working on a project addressing violence against women, you can submit your project to the ANRO's Register of Active Research, which is a centralised and publicly available database of domestic and family violence research that is currently underway. Again, I'd like to thank all of our panel. It's been a really, really insightful and very useful conversation. I'm Michelle Robinson, and on behalf of ANRO's, thank you and goodbye.